I'm the Woodland Carbon Code's Communications Coordinator. I'd like to welcome you all today and thank you for joining us for our webinar. This is the fifth in our series of webinars, and our presenters today, Vicky and Natalie, will provide an overview of natural regeneration under the Woodland Carbon Code. They'll be touching on eligibility requirements and providing advice on registration, validation and verification. We'll then open out the discussion to answer your questions on natural regeneration. So please do pop any in the chat and we'll come back and answer them at the end. And just to say, my colleague Alice will be leading the question and answer session today. We'd also like to highlight that we're recording today's session, so you can watch back, and anyone who wasn't able to attend can also watch the recording. But now, without much further ado, I'll get underway by introducing our presenters. Dr. Vicky West is the manager of the Woodland Carbon Code. With a background in climate science and forestry policy, she's played a vital role in the development of the code since it was launched in 2011. And originally from Australia, my colleague Natalie Meiklejohn has a background in ecology and carbon management. She's one of our coordinators and she provides guidance to users of the code on a daily basis. And Natalie joined our team last year. So together, Vicky and Natalie provide a wealth of experience. So I'm certain their presentation will provide a helpful insight into natural regeneration. So for now, it's over to you, Natalie and Vicky. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So Susan's just talked you through the agenda, but I'm going to give you a bit of a background on natural regen in the Woodland Carbon Code and talk a little bit about the eligibility, and I'll hand over to Nat to talk through how we deal with your documents and things for registration and validation, and then I'll come back in and talk about verification, some changes that we might think about making in future, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So as Alice has just put in the chat, if anybody has any questions, do pop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. So let's get started. So natural regen's always been part of the Woodland Carbon Code, but recently this year we provided some improved guidance in our clarification 1 to the Woodland Carbon Code, and that provides more information about how we handle natural regeneration at each stage of the process. So today we're going to show you what's different about the way we handle natural regeneration compared to planted projects in the Woodland Carbon Code. So in our guidance, our clarification in April, we've improved the carbon calculator for natural regeneration. We've given more guidance on the seedling survey that you complete as a baseline for your natural regeneration, and we've provided some example maps. Given natural regen and the success is less predictable than with a planted woodland, we're very conservative in our estimates. We look at what's likely to be successful, and we issue a small number of units up front. So where there's evidence that the natural regeneration will work, we issue those units up front. Where there's no evidence yet that the natural regeneration will occur, and we might need a bit longer, then we wait to issue units at verification. So just because it's less predictable, we're just a bit more conservative up front than with planting schemes, but you still have the opportunity to claim all the carbon credits that you would be due for any of the actual growth in the trees. So if that natural regeneration is managed well and it gets away well and sequesters lots of carbon, then you will get those units over time rather than upfront. So just a little bit about eligibility, and let's think what makes natural regen eligible. So there needs to be some intervention to enable that regeneration to happen. So it can't be something that's going to happen anyway without any human intervention. I know that's quite unlikely in the UK that would happen, but you need to either show that you need to have new or improved herbivore or deer management or fencing to enable the regeneration to be successful. In terms of the kind of stage that things need to be at the start of the project, Obviously, with natural regeneration, there's going to be some, or there may be some seedlings present already, but we need to be looking at projects which are at the start of that process rather than woodland that might be defined as established. So the way we're thinking about that at the moment is that your seedlings need to be, if there are any seedlings present, they need to be less than 0.5 metre on average in height. There can be some slightly bigger seedlings than that, but on average across your site, it needs to be less than 0.5 metre in height. And those seedlings, there needs to be evidence of browsing, so those seedlings need to be suppressed. And the definition of that at the moment is that 50% of the seedlings need to show high or very high browsing levels. We also need to make sure, like a planting project, I guess, we need to make sure that we map out any of the areas that you can't claim as woodland. So that might be deep peat, rocky outcrops, archaeology, anything else that UKFS says is a sensitive area where it shouldn't be planted. And you need to map out existing woodland above 1/4 hectare. So that's anything above 20% canopy or 400 stems per hectare. So again, with natural regeneration, we might be thinking about kind of encouraging new woodland where there is some existing individual trees or small clumps. So we just need to think carefully how we map what we claim and what is already woodland. And just as a reminder for all woodland creation projects, including natural regeneration, you need to apply for an environmental impact assessment decision. However that process works in the country that you're in, but you do still need the EIA to be assessed before you go ahead. So just a little bit more on eligibility. The other thing that we haven't done yet, but we are proposing to do, is to change the definition of what we call the implementation date and the start date. So for planting, the implementation date is basically before you do anything on site. You know, the date you start doing anything on site is your implementation date, and the date that you finish is when all the planting is finished. So for natural regeneration, what we'd specified in terms of for natural regeneration where you weren't fencing, but you are just looking at enhanced deer control, the guidance wasn't very clear. Now, we haven't updated this yet, but this is what we're proposing to do the next time we update the standard, and hopefully this is helpful. So welcome any feedback at this stage. So for the implementation date, we're proposing to changing it from just saying deer control to say the implementation date is when you adopt an enhanced herbivore or deer management plan. So it's the date that you agree to either start managing the deer or managing the deer more intensively so that natural regeneration will be successful. And then the start date, we're proposing to change it to the date where an enhanced herbivore deer management plan has begun to be implemented. So you might have agreed that you will be doing more intensive deer management, but this is the date that the stalker actually goes out with the intention to change the way things are done. So in theory, these could be the same date for natural regeneration. You could agree the plan and the stalker go out that afternoon, but we accept that they're going to be quite close. So we're going to talk about registration at the moment. But the key, I guess, is that if you're thinking about enabling natural regeneration by more intense deer management, you need to register before you change the way that you are managing things on site. So I guess for anybody thinking about natural regeneration, the earlier you register, the better, before you've changed any of those intentions. That's all I'm going to say about the kind of background and eligibility just now. And I'm going to hand over to Nat, and she's going to tell you a bit more about registration and verification of natural regeneration projects. Thanks, Nat.
Vicky. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just going to take us through the registration documents for a Nat Regen project, as they do differ slightly from standard planting projects. So as usual at the registration stage, the only things we're looking to see are the carbon calculator and a PDF map of the project. But the most important thing when preparing documents for Nat Regen is that we need to understand which one of these two categories your Nat Regen areas fall under. And so the two categories are upfront claimable and future claimable. And Vicky kind of touched on those earlier, but I guess those are the kind of names that we give them, upfront or future claimable. And so the best way I have to explain this is kind of to get you to imagine a project with a strip of existing woodland, and you're going to fence off an entire field and allow that woodland to regenerate. So under our guidance, any area that is within 50 meters of that strip of existing woodland is automatically classed as upfront claimable. And that's because we feel comfortable issuing PIUs. We feel comfortable saying, yep, this area is going to regenerate. Here are your pending carbon credits. So that's upfront claimable. Any part of that field which is further than 50 meters away from that existing woodland, obviously we hope it will regenerate. We might be relatively sure that it will regenerate, but at this point in time, we can't guarantee it, and we're not as confident. And so we're not going to issue PIUs, pending issuance units, for those areas. You'll have to wait until verification, where you'll then be issued the woodland carbon units, because people will actually go on site and survey what's growing. And that's why we call it future claimable. I will flag there is a little bit of an exception to this, which is if you go out and complete a seedling survey in that area and you're able to prove that there is already regeneration occurring beyond that 50 meters from the seed source. But I'll go into that a little bit later when I show some example maps. In terms of how you add Nat regeneration to the carbon calculator, essentially any area that is upfront claimable, so within 50 meters of a seed source, you can include in table 2, which is your species table, which is where you would just put all of your standard planting area as well. And that will count towards your PIUs. Future claimable areas, so stuff that is beyond 50 meters from a seed source, you do not include it in table 2. You would still include it in your net area. So, in your soil emissions and in that net area, which is in cell E7, I think it is. But you don't include it in table 2 because we can't count it towards your PIUs. So what you would do is just keep that area in your net area and put a comment in the comment section at the bottom of the calculator that says, for example, the net area includes 10 hectares of future claimable, and we'll be able to compare that to your map as well. How exactly you include upfront claimable in table 2 is that you use either the Nat Regen mixed broadleaf or Nat Regen Scots pine drop-down categories in that species table. And for spacing, please note that we know that in previous versions of the carbon calculator, you may have usually had to complete an effective area calculation for Nat Regen because the spacing is often a bit bigger than planted areas, usually 4.5, 5 meter spacing. But in the latest version of the carbon calculator, which we released this year, which is version 2.4.1, which you can download from our website, we've included options and models for spacing of 3, 4, and 5 meters. So you shouldn't have to do any more effective area calculations. The yield class for Nat Regen projects will be either 2 or 4, depending on your site conditions. And as Vicky mentioned, the Nat Regen in the carbon calculator, the models are quite conservative, but please be assured that any real additional carbon that is sequestered will be captured when you do verification, when people go out and survey, and you will be issued that in the form of woodland carbon units. And also just to flag, if you're feeling a bit unsure about any of the documents that you're submitting for registration, please feel free to reach out and email us, and we're happy to look things over and answer any questions you have. But here we have these maps on our website now, which you're able to look at as examples of what we're kind of looking for in a Nat Regen project. So on this map, you can see the existing woodland is clearly marked out in this strip of dark green. And the Nat Regen areas are marked to distinguish them as either upfront or future claimable. So you've got this strip of light green here, which is the 50 meter buffer. So everything there is upfront claimable. And then on the outside here in this kind of bluey grey colour, you've got your future claimable. So that's beyond 50 metres of the seed source, and we're not claiming PIUs for that. You will note that on this map, there is a different sort of area here in the light blue, which has been marked as upfront claimable, but it is beyond 50 metres of the seed source. And so for this area, if you were to submit this, we would want to see a seedling survey as well. I would say that most people opt kind of not to do the seedling survey at the registration stage and kind of wait until validation when we're actually looking to issue PIUs. But if you have that data and you want to submit it at registration, you're also obviously welcome to do that. Once registration is complete and the project has started, as usual, you have 3 years to validate your project. And so here on the slide is just a list of the documents that are required at the validation stage for Nat Regen. So obviously you'll already have your PDF map and your carbon calculator from when you registered the project. You may just have to update those slightly if there's been any changes in the 3 years between registration and validation. Additionally, you'll need your herbivore or deer management plan, and that should outline the impacts of grazing and how this will be managed to allow for regeneration. As well as this, you'll need an operational plan. This will have some detail on soil moisture and nutrients, as well as outlining how competing vegetation might be managed. So if there's vegetation that might compete with your regen, how are we going to manage that on site? And also whether there's a plan for if there is too little or too much Nat Regen occurring. So you either might have to do some supplementary planting or some respacing of saplings to make sure that things are growing. You'll also need to submit a map of the seedling density, and finally, you'll need to submit your seedling survey results. So here's another example map that we have online, and this is what we'd kind of be expecting to see as your seedling density map. So for most projects, we're looking for 5.6 metre plots over a 100 by 100 metre grid. But for smaller projects, we do sort of accept just a basic number of plots, which are outlined there on the slide, and that's for projects up to 12 hectares. And then in each plot, we're looking for, as Vicky mentioned, the number of seedlings which are smaller than 0.5 metres, and then the number of saplings between 0.5 metres and 1 metre. And then the last thing that's submitted at the validation stage is the results of the seedling survey. Just a quick note that we are looking to sort of develop a template spreadsheet for this, but that's still in development. So at the moment, as long as you submit something which contains all of these details on it, you're grand from our perspective. So yeah, this is the information that we're looking for. As I mentioned, we need to know the number of seedlings smaller than 0.5 metres and the saplings between 0.5 and 1. And this is what's classed as your regen. Any saplings that are greater than 1 metre tall or trees with a diameter at breast height greater than 7 centimetres are actually regarded as established growth. So there needs to be less than 400 stems per hectare of this vegetation in the area for it still to be classified as regeneration. Anything above 400 stems per hectare, and we'd actually already consider it sort of established woodland. As Vicky mentioned, we also need information on herbivore damage, so the percentage of seedlings and saplings that are browsed and the level of browsing. And finally, for each of the plots, we need information about the closest seed source, so the direction and the distance. We need a grid reference for each of the plots and a photo of each of the plots. And finally, last thing I'm going to say is just to flag that we have had a couple of projects reach out to us as they've kind of struggled to capture herbivore damage during sampling season. So due to maybe the topography of the site or weather conditions, when they actually go out and sample, it's quite difficult to get that herbivore damage. But they do have evidence over multiple years that the seedlings are not growing. So just wanted to flag that if that is something that's affecting your project and you have sort of concerns about being able to capture that herbivore damage properly, please do reach out because we might be able to help. Yeah, so I'm going to pass back over to Vicky to talk about the verification process.
Thanks, Nat. So that's all on registration validation. So in terms of verification, for natural regen projects, we currently follow the same survey protocol as with planted woodlands. and the same process as with planted woodlands. So we expect verification to occur at year 5, year 15, year 25. The slight difference, given the way we modelled or predicted the carbon sequestration, is that in the prediction for natural regen, we've shifted everything back 5 years. So what would have been the expectation at year 5 for a planted project is kind of the expectation for year 10 for a natural regeneration project or natural regeneration area. So that means that when we get to year 5 for your natural regen project, we don't expect as much success growth as with a planted woodland. So when you get to year 5, provided that you've got at least 400 seedlings per hectare and they're now over 0.5 metre with browsing under control, then that would be deemed as kind of successful or a green RAG rating for your project at year 5. You might get corrective actions if you still don't have 400 seedlings per hectare, or if there are signs of browsing pressure that's going to not be helpful with the continued growth of the woodland, or if there are any health issues. In terms of year 15, that's when we'd expect you to reach the target stocking density for your natural regeneration. So if you were hoping to end up with, on average, 3 metre spacing, obviously it's going to be quite variable. If you, let's say, if you hope to have 1,100 stems per hectare, we'd hope you to kind of reach that stocking density by year 15 rather than by year 5. At year 15, we could potentially review your carbon prediction, and if the woodland is growing well by year 15 and we're confident that it's going to sequester more, we could review your calculation and potentially issue more PIUs for the future years. So generally with natural regeneration, we're just being really conservative up front, and the key is that if your woodland's growing well and it has actually sequestered more, you get those units at verification. Getting units at verification means that either if you're looking to use them yourself, you can use them instantly against your emissions. If you're looking to sell them, then whoever you're selling to at verification can use them straight away as well in terms of compensating for their own emissions. That's all I was going to say on verification. I just wanted to then say this is all work in progress. We'd welcome your feedback on any of the way that it's set out and working at the moment. These are just some thoughts about how we might improve things in future. We're planning an update to the standard later this year, so some of these things we might be able to include then. Some of you might be aware we also have a CivTech project that is out for interested parties at the moment. So CivTech is innovation funding through Scottish Government, and we're looking at more novel ways to look at monitoring and verifying Woodland Carbon Code projects. So that might also help with some ideas on how best to monitor natural regeneration in future. So just thinking about other ways we might improve things. In terms of eligibility, I've mentioned that we were going to update the implementation and start dates. Welcome anybody's thoughts. The other thing which Nat mentioned earlier is that there are some projects that have been monitoring their seedling densities over the last few years. And whilst the time that they monitor those projects, they might not necessarily pick up browsing, they've shown that those seedlings haven't been getting away and that they need to do more deer management to enable them to get away. So we're looking at how we might facilitate those projects to be involved as well. And then in terms of the seedling survey, we've had some feedback from different people, and we'll probably make further clarifications in some areas of the seedling survey just so that it's easier to use. And as Nat mentioned, try to provide a template for those results. We have spoken to a couple of people who are actually using an app to collect their seedling survey data. And again, we can think what we can provide or what direction and guidance we could provide so that you might be able to do that yourselves through open access tools. Because if you can collect it via an app and load it straight into a database, it's going to be much easier to deal with. In terms of year 5 and year 15, obviously the plot survey at the moment is designed primarily around planted woodlands, and we need to think whether that is appropriate or how we can make it work more efficiently for natural regeneration in future. So we're doing some thinking on that, and there are various people that are looking at remote sensing and trialing remote sensing for natural regeneration. And I mentioned the CivTech project. So hopefully in future we can come up with other ways which we could use technology to help with the monitoring of natural regeneration projects. And hopefully it'll be much easier to capture information about the whole site in that kind of way. That's all I'm going to say about the future improvements for now. So I'll hand over to Alice, who's going to lead us through the questions you've been putting in the chat. So please do keep adding to the questions as we're talking through them. But Alice, do you want to make a start on the questions for us?
Sure. If people have any more questions, please keep them coming in the chat. Got a first question from Chris asking how Nat Regen features in continuous cover forestry.
Okay, so I guess we're talking here about areas which are just natural regeneration areas. And at the moment, the way we suggest people model their continuous cover forestry in the prediction is to use the thin only model in the carbon calculator. We recognise that this isn't ideal for CCF either, but it's the best way that we can handle it at the moment in terms of the prediction. When it comes to the surveying at verification, obviously we're kind of advocating the same survey for all types of woodland creation at the moment, so you would just do your survey as normal.
Okay, moving on, the question from David, referring to the slide 5 deer management slide, about the agreement for the enhanced deer herbivore plan and who will monitor the effectiveness of that agreement and who says whether the plan will be effective or not.
So I guess it depends what country you're in and what grant is available. Because if you are also applying for a grant for natural regeneration, you might have to agree that deer management plan to enable you to get a grant, in which case if you've got a deer management plan agreed for grant purposes, then we would accept that as part of the Woodland Carbon Code. Within the Woodland Carbon Code, obviously our third-party validators would look at your deer management plan to see if they thought it was going to be effective or not. In terms of the monitoring, I guess projects are responsible for monitoring their own projects in terms of success. And if you want to be able to claim the carbon credits at each verification, then you need to make sure that that deer management plan is followed and review the plan if it's not working. And then at verification, I guess we would review how your project is doing, and potentially you would get other corrective actions, which might include changing your deer management plan if it didn't look like it was working.
We've got a couple more questions about the herbivore plan and deer management plan, so I'm going to just group them together as we're talking about it. Does the herbivore plan need to consider and differentiate between damage caused by different herbivores, for example, voles, rabbits, or hares, or is it just about deer?
I guess whatever is important in your area, and yes, consider all of the potential threats to your seedlings, and in terms of having a plan to make sure that your woodland creation is successful.
And following on from that, is herbivore damage the only factor considered for failure of Nat Regen? And how is weed competition assessed and considered?
So in the documents that you need to provide for validation, there is also an operational plan, and some of the detail in the operational plan, which I think was, I can't remember what slide that was on that. slide 10, I think, that in the operational plan, you also need to consider the kind of soil moisture and nutrient status. You need to think about managing the competition with other vegetation, and you need to think about managing the regeneration if there is too much or too little. So those things would go in your operational plan.
Thank you. Moving on to some questions about seed sources. The UCO criteria is 75 meters from a seed source for nat regen. Someone wants to know why we used 50.
So this is one of the benefits of devolution. So in Scotland, the grant team used 50 meters as the threshold for natural regeneration in terms of that initial boundary. And within the Woodland Carbon Code, we've chosen the most conservative option, if you like. So we're being consistent with the Scottish guidance, which is 50 meters. Obviously, we have also said that if you have regeneration out of that 50 meters and you've done a seedling survey to show there's some evidence of seedlings there already, then you can claim more than 50, more than 75 meters. You could potentially be claiming hundreds of meters if there is some evidence there up front.
Continuing with the seed source questions, do hedgerows with hedgerow trees count as a potential seed source within a 50-meter buffer? And do existing hedgerows need to be mapped out?
So if you have a hedgerow which has trees in it which are producing seed, then those could be identified as seed sources, yes. In terms of needing to map out a hedgerow, we said you have to actually map out an area if it is 1/4 of a hectare's worth of established woodland. If it's less than 1/4 of a hectare's worth, then you have to just identify the individual trees or clumps of trees. But you don't take them out of the area.
Cool. Most detailed questions. I've got like a whole list here. I think this is the most questions I've had in a webinar for a while. Does the assessment of seed source take any consideration of the species and age of the source? For example, species that don't develop viable seeds, trees too old young to reproduce, or the viability of that species on the specific soil?
Yes, but we're leaving it with you as the woodland manager to determine which of the trees you think would be producing viable seed for the woodland that you're hoping to encourage regeneration.
Perfect. Another question, why is it necessary to evidence browsing pressure rather than simply the business as usual scenario is no regen on unvegetated land? So for example, why would you need to reference historical Earth observation data?
So I guess one of the issues with the Woodland Carbon Code is we need to show that this is additional woodland creation. So we need to know that the natural regen isn't going to happen without us taking some intervention. And it's that intervention and the cost of it that you're claiming is necessary. And therefore it is why you need the carbon finance to help you with the project. So hopefully that's enough, but I'm happy to say more if that doesn't quite answer the question.
That hasn't answered the question, just let us know in the chat, Rob. A question about the example map, which excluded the areas of peat as unplantable. John's saying that other areas hydrologically linked to peat, for example, the upstream catchment area, is also excluded, but can that be like as an unplantable land, but would that be able to be used to claim natural regeneration?
So anything that would be anything that is excluded under UKFS. So if it, I guess, if you're thinking about it as deep peat or anything that affects the hydrology of surrounding areas, you should exclude in the same way that you would for planted areas for any other woodland creation scheme.
two more questions. I've got a question about control of invasive non-native species, for example, rhododendron. Would control of non-native species be considered an intervention or an eligible intervention?
Potentially, we might need to consider those projects, but potentially, if somebody's got an example, then please do send it in and let's discuss.
And one last question in the chat, but if anyone has any more, they're welcome to put those in. Someone who has a project who says they've not been allowed to include native broadleaf saplings in the upfront PIU calculations that they planted just after the start of their project, and asking if they're able to add those in or include them.
Given I don't know anything about the background of this particular project, it's probably better that you send us the details to the info@woodlandcarboncode.org.uk address, and I'll have a little look at it and try and understand what's going on with your project.
I'll pop that address in the chat for anyone who would like to send us an email about specific projects. One last question. Why does the spreadsheet only have Nat Regen, Scots Pine, and Broadleaf, but not, for example, Nat Regen for Sitka Spruce?
I guess initially the main driver for this was the desire of people wanting to create native woodlands through natural regeneration. If there is, we could think about whether or not we would include natural regeneration of commercial conifer species, but we've not included that so far.
Got a question from Rob. I'm just trying to figure out which one it refers to. It's referring back to one of the many questions we've had today. So it's referring back to the question about, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, evidencing browsing pressure with field photos rather than simply business as usual scenario of no regen on unvegetated land. Rob was more considering how 20-year-old Earth observation time series, which indicates no regen, could help in confirming additionality.
Potentially, I guess, yeah, let's think about how we could include other sources of evidence for showing that there isn't any regen under the current system. We'd have to think that through a bit, I think, but I'm happy to discuss, Rob.
Perfect. That's all the questions we've had. Some really good ones in there. If anyone has any more, please pop them in the chat. If you have any questions about a specific project or a specific issue, you're welcome to drop us an email as well.
And can I just say as well, yeah, thank you for all the questions. This natural regeneration is more work in progress. As I said, we're looking to kind of make some more changes and improve the guidance over the next iteration of the standard. So do appreciate any feedback and thoughts as we do that.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Some really great questions, and thanks to Alice for leading the Q&A and to Nat and Vicky for their interesting presentations today. So yeah, I'm just going to put a quick feedback poll into the chat area. Really appreciate any feedback on our subject today. And I'd also like to highlight before we finish up that we have another webinar in our series coming up very soon. It will be on Tuesday, the 1st of October, and our topic will be validating your project under the Woodland Carbon Code. So we do hope you can join us for that. You can find details of that webinar on our website or in our newsletter, and you can sign up to our newsletter from our website. So yes, that's it. Thanks again for coming today. Thanks again to our presenters, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.